Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Spain. As a Canadian, we always appreciate coming somewhere warm in the wintertime. So I'm going to talk about something very different from my specialization today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the DRI process. First, I'll give a little bit of a background just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we had a meeting in Ottawa because these dietary reference intakes have changed a little bit, or they're changing. And there might be some opportunities for omega-3s, so we hosted a workshop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize the workshop for you, essentially as if you were there. And I'll try and do it in a way that I think is true to what the speakers believe, not necessarily trying to lay over my opinions, but you can get an idea of where some of these things are going. And then we'll talk about some future directions. So just to bring us on the same page, and I think everybody knows this, the first omega-3 in the pathway is alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, I often call it, and it's typically the plant, flaxseed, canola, the Canadian crop, and some vegetables. And this omega-3 is consumed in large amounts, gram quantities in many countries. Now, what we can do with this omega-3 is we can convert it to EPA and DHA, the reason so many of you here. And this is different than a lot of the other essential nutrients, right? Essential nutrients are essentially things you can't synthesize, and that's why they're essential. Now, there's a lot of debate about the efficacy of this pathway, how quick it goes, but it can happen. So that's just that's a problem when you're trying to define a nutrient as essential. And so, whether you get it from fish, and you might think that's a more important source, it's just a little hiccup in the pathway when you're dealing with people who are trying to define essential fatty acids. But it's not unprecedented. And here's a study from the amino acid field where they've looked at cysteine, which is not an essential amino acid, and it decreases your requirements for methionine, which is an amino acid. I was actually a participant in this stable isotope study. It was done in my university. So there is some room where one nutrient that's not considered essential can influence the other one. There's also some academics who've done some work on this. My former boss, Stephen Kinane, was trying to figure out some of the wording here. And he did some of this work 15 years ago, and it really didn't catch on. What they tried to do is come up with, say, well, maybe let's not work at essential or inessential. Let's call them dispensable or indispensable, which is grammatically a little weird. And then you can say, well, ALA is indispensable. But some of these other ones might be conditionally indispensable depending on your life stage. And people played around with this, but it's disappeared. It hasn't really taken off. So what do we have? We've currently got a framework that's shifting, and I'm going to go back to the history of it a little bit, because it was based on the idea of inadequacy. And a lot of people think this framework is actually inadequate. And it's based on the ideas of deficiency. So the dietary recommended intakes, this is a big joint initiative between Canada and the United States. The United States always takes credit for it, but the Canadians were there. Joint panel set this up. And what you've got is you've got this graph here at the bottom, and you've got this risk of inadequacy going up the y-axis, and then increase in dietary intake. So let's pretend it's vitamin C. Where you get the EAR is the intake, the estimated average requirement of a group of an individual, is where you'd expect 50% of the people to meet their requirement, so not have bleeding gums or scurvy, and 50% to not meet it and have the bleeding gums or scurvy. And you have to be careful with this number, because if you guys ate that level, half of you would be deficient, half of you wouldn't. So what they do is they do some simple math and they shift it over to the RDA, and that's where you want people to eat, because at the RDA, there's only about a 2% chance anybody would be deficient if you consume that level. And at the other end, you've got an upper level where you wouldn't want to go past that because the levels might be too high. And that's the model people have. But there's something missing in there, and if you see in the definitions, there's something called an adequate intake. For the omega-3s, we currently have adequate intake levels. We don't have EARs or RDAs. So what's an adequate intake? Well, this is taken from the document. It's 1,000 and some pages. And what they said was, Basically, low ALA levels can lead to skin problems. In the US, we don't have these deficiency skin problems. In the US, people eat about 1.6 grams for males, 1.1 grams for females. Therefore, that is the AI. So it's the amount of alpha-linolenic acid that a population of Americans eat. And this is important because there's a lot of mistakes made with this number. People say, well, you're not meeting the AI. Well, who cares? Half of the Americans, by definition, are not meeting the AI. It's like a guess. It's saying we don't have a gross deficiency in the population. Let's put a number out there. So you'll see this. You'll see this in scientific papers where people will talk about intakes being lower than the AI, but it's not really that meaningful. It just means you're lower than the average American intake. For EPA and DHA, it actually gets a little weirder because what they did was they said, well, intakes of EPA and DHA in this population range from 0 to 10% of the ALA intake. So that's about 160 milligrams, 80 milligrams of each, people often say it, but it actually means 0 to 10%. So it's 0 milligrams to 160 milligrams. You can divide that up however you want. So that is currently what the Canadian US recommendations for omega-3s are. Where's it going? Well, this guiding principles document, which was another massive document, just came out, and what they wanted to do is they want to get away from this idea of deficiency that was, nutrition in the early 1900s kind of approach. And they're pushing towards making nutrient recommendations to prevent, not treat, but to prevent chronic diseases. And they're trying to make a model of this, and I put a paper here by Amanda McFarlane that kind of summarizes it all. It's published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and she gave a really concise overview of how this approach works and what it looks like. I expect Harry Rice is probably the only person to read the actual full document. That is about 1,000 pages. So David Ma, who's in the top corner here, and I were talking in Canada. He's a professor at the University of Guelph, about 2 hours from me. And to be honest, we were confused. How's this going to work? So we applied for a grant to the Canadian government, and I'll come back to the funding later because this is important. And we said, we want to have a workshop with some of the people making these guidelines because we don't know them and they don't know us. I don't know if they know anything about omega-3s, but they're going to be the people making these decisions. And we got the funding, and in December of 2019, we had a workshop. And now I'm going to take you through the workshop and kind of go through the lectures one by one. The first person we had was the author of the last paper I showed you, Amanda McFarlane, who's from Health Canada, and you can see that was the title of her talk. And she gave a very interesting talk because she said the first thing you need to prevent chronic diseases is we need to know it's causal, and we need to be very clear on this. There needs to be very good evidence for this. So, heart disease, etc. She was okay with the idea of surrogate outcomes, and this gets really important because she used the example of sodium. And they're really convinced that sodium affects blood pressure. Now, the connection between sodium and heart disease is a little iffy, but sodium affects blood pressure, and they're really convinced with that. And so this model, what they've got is if you lower sodium intake, you lower your blood pressure. And they thought there was high quality evidence for that. The link between sodium and heart disease itself was a little iffy. So if you think of fish oils and cardiovascular disease, there's evidence there. We could debate if it's moderate or high, but the mechanism's tricky. I don't think anybody knows what the mechanism is. So the model would be a little different than sodium, where you might argue you have better endpoint data, but the surrogate isn't as clear. The other thing that all these people are about is the hierarchy of evidence, which I'm sure some people have seen this, right? At the bottom, you have expert opinions, so exactly what I'm doing right now, and you go up until you get randomized controlled trials, and the ultimate top is the synthesis of the randomized controlled trials, either in a systematic review or a meta-analysis. And the person I'm replacing always makes the joke, the evidence for the hierarchy of evidence, do you know what it comes from? Expert opinion, the very lowest thing on the totem pole, on the pyramid, drives the whole pyramid. It's just a little bit of an irony. But this is how it works. And this, for predicting the future, I think this is now, and this is going to be the future of medicine for a while, this hierarchy of evidence. We then had Susan Carlson come in, who's well known for her work on infant feeding, and she gave a twist to her talk I didn't see coming. She summarized evidence on preterm births as the endpoint, and she showed a meta-analysis by one of my friends and colleagues, Maria Makrides. And what they've been doing is they've been putting together all the RCTs of fish oil studies and looking at the length of gestation. And if you've never seen one of these, the line down the middle is kind of no effect. The little square is the average, and when the lines kind of cross that line down the middle, they're not significant. And if you go down to the bottom, where there's a big triangle, if it's not touching the lines, it's significant. You always have to guess left or right if it's good or bad. But on this case, if you're on the left-hand side where the total evidence is, and all these trials with thousands and thousands of people show that we can increase gestation period with omega-3 supplements and delay preterm births. And this is good, and the evidence is considered high quality. Now, obviously, it only affects a certain portion of the population. It doesn't affect males, and it doesn't affect all females. But it's good quality evidence, and I think we have some idea what the mechanism of this is. So this could be something that could be of interest to make a dietary reference intake. Susan also pointed out some really nice advantages in infant studies, trying to measure infant IQs and infant behaviors. I think it was really elegant. But she said that she didn't think it was prime time or ready for a recommendation. Again, the surrogate is experimentally interesting, but maybe not convincing to a panel. Then we had Ken Stark from the University of Waterloo, and he talked about the evidence for cardiovascular disease. And he talked about a recent meta-analysis, and there's been a lot of these, and this is the newest one that I know of so far, and 127,000 participants, a lot of subjects in it. And again, when you line up all the studies and you get down to the stars at the bottom, you get, depending if you include a recent study by Amarin, which is going to be tricky because it's considered a drug, but if you include it, you get a strong effect. But even if you exclude it, you get a benefit for fish oils and cardiovascular disease. And I think this is reasonably strong evidence, but the mechanism's not exactly clear. But anyways, it's something that could be considered to go forward for a recommendation. Ken talked a lot about dose responses, which is obviously important. You need to know how much populations eat if you're going to make recommendations. And he wore a Santa hat for his talk, which was just remarkable because I've absolutely never seen that. And I took a picture of it, and he's not here, so I get to show a picture of him looking a little, perhaps, silly. The next talk was Melanie Plurd, who's an up-and-coming star in the field of nutrition and cognition. And I really like this talk. It's kind of in my area, but it's an emerging field. She reviewed some meta-analyses, very critical study designs. And I think this is important. You got to look at these studies very critically. And one of the big issues with cognition is I don't think, at least I'm not trying when I do my studies to improve anybody's IQ or improve your memory. What we're trying to do is stop the decline or slow down the decline. And that's very hard to do because if you take a group of healthy people and you start them 1 year in the study and you measure them 2 years later, nobody's changed. The placebo hasn't changed. So these studies are, we're very interested in this work, but this is really, really hard to do. And that's sometimes called a ceiling effect, where you can't improve people who are already, improved. And she also pointed out, and I think this is something important, that we need to start thinking about other nutrients. As scientists, we're always very reductionist. Is it fish oil? Is it EPA? Is it some derivative of EPA? And we go down. But she's, let's talk about foods and diets in general. Catherine Field, an immunologist, spoke about immunity and inflammation. This one it's a tricky area, and I think Catherine would say right up front, this isn't an area that we should explore too far. I think it's an exciting area, an exciting research area. But they're a bit confused in the field right now. They're having a very hard time defining inflammation in humans, and then they're having a very hard time defining whether it's good or bad, because you need some inflammation to fight infections, but you don't want too much. And they're proposing new strategies to look at a panel of biomarkers of inflammation, not just one thing. And that in this field, EPA and DHA give very different results, so they're not interchangeable. And that's actually a bit of a problem too, because we don't really have recommendations for nutrients in a combo yet. Everything's been very, vitamin C or vitamin D, calcium and vitamin D, but now people are starting to talk about putting them together. So it was interesting. Allison Yates then gave out what I think was a really important talk, because I had no idea what was coming here. But she talked about how we could develop a framework for bioactive substances. And that's interesting because bioactive substances aren't necessarily nutrients. And the example she gave were some antioxidants in coffee and some studies they were doing to try and link them to heart health. And why I think this is important is because EPA and DHA, while they're nutrients and we can debate their essentiality, they're bioactive substances, and you can put them together or take them apart, just like you could do with antioxidants. And they proposed some of this work. Some of it was done in the context of an upper level of intake, a level you wouldn't want to consume more of, but it provides a framework anyways, I think a starting point by which we could say, hey, we could put these two nutrients together in a package like fish oil and not worry about A or B or the EPA or the DHA and go forward with this in the context of a nutrient recommendation. This came up again, and I'm going to bring this up. George Wells is a statistician from the University of Ottawa, and he was involved in the statistics that were done to put sodium forward as a guideline. And they're all about systematic reviews, and I'm looking forward to one of the talks coming up because you need access to all the clinical trials, and that's a lot of work, and then you got to put it all together, and we need better tools for that. And then the other thing is you got to grade the evidence, and that's just a way of saying, are these good quality studies? Are they, is it strong evidence? And it depends on the effect size and how clean the effect is and how reproducible it is. But I want to show you an interesting meta-analysis because some of the stuff's not all that clear. And on this one here, what you've got is 3 clinical trials that have looked at salt intake and the risk of hypertension. So salt intake affects blood pressure, yes. But in their guidelines, they also say it lowers blood pressure for the DRIs. But what you've got here is 3 studies, and none of the studies show a beneficial effect of lowering salt on hypertension. When you do the meta-analysis and you put all the studies together, that little triangle doesn't touch the line anymore and is significant. And the conservative statisticians say, therefore, sodium is protective against hypertension, even though we've never shown it in a study. And this is the reality of stats and math now. People do it and they take it very seriously. I'll throw my opinion. I would read this as saying we need a bigger study to show that that's the real fact and we need more power. But this is what you're dealing with these things. And I think this is a good thing because the meta-analyses on cardiovascular disease are positive, despite not all the studies being positive. So I think this is a positive step forward for the omega-3 field. So that was the end of our meeting. Those were literally all the speakers we have. And now some conclusions and future directions. Do we go for deficiency approach, or do we go through this new chronic disease reduction approach? Anytime somebody gives me a question like this, I say we're both, right? I think we need to continue to explore this. If we can find some biomarkers of low intake of omega-3s or how they change in terms of the biochemical pathway. I'll let you know right now I'm working hardly on, we think that we found a step where you feed DHA that it inhibits an enzyme that converts EPA to DPA, and it's a feedback inhibition thing. We just showed it in humans, so I'd like to explore that. Is there a level of DHA that you get to that starts to shut down the pathway? I'm hypothesizing, I don't know the answer, but I think it means we've got enough coming in, let's slow the pathway down. And if I'm right, that could be a marker of a requirement. So we'd like to take that forward. But these meta-analyses are big, and the statisticians really like the meta-analyses. So that's definitely a way to go forward, and that fits the chronic disease reduction risk. How do you get the Institute of Medicine Committee to review EPA and DHA? And I actually don't know the answer here. Not sure. But I think we got things started. We had a meeting. We invited government officials to Ottawa. We got to know them, which is important. We showed them the evidence. They showed us the standards. And now I think we need to think about how we do this next. Can we do this in the US with some of the people that would be involved in the committee from the US? Should we consider doing this in some other countries that aren't in the same framework or model as the Can-Am system? The bottom line, though, and this is my bias as a researcher, the better the data is, the easier this is going to be. The clearer the effect, the clearer the surrogate, the clearer the endpoint, the clearer the dose response, the easier it is going to be to convince them. And I think ways of synthesizing the data are going to be very important. And then we're going to have to sit down and say, in the next 5 to 10 years, what data is missing? What's the critical, 3-4 studies here we should do that we can make this go forward? And I'd like to thank a couple people. This is my last slide. This is a grant we wrote that was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which is the Canadian equivalent to the NIH. But it was also really important that some people in the room here and GOED stepped up and co-sponsored this, because we were able to, have government funding is not what it used to be, especially not for conferences, but GOED, DSM, who's here, me, Johnson might be here. I saw Carrie a few times from PharmaVite. Were able to give us some support, and we were able to get all these people together, and we were able to get the ball rolling. I'm expecting to have a draft publication in February that hopefully will come out, and then we really need to stop and think about the next steps. So I've got a little bit of time left that I'll yield, and I'll thank you very much for your attention today.